happened, but Derek helped really break the Byrds and the Beach Boys to an audience other than, you know, just the mass hit single kind of audience that they had.
From teenage girls to...
Yeah. And certainly Derek was responsible for their tremendous success in England, which was...
So we know, I know from reading your book about the great pressures on Brian Wilson during the period he's doing the Smile album. So you were hanging around him. Did he seem to be disintegrating at the time? I mean, what was the deal?
Well, I'd met him for the first time. No, the point was that for me or anybody else who came around that scene, you'd never met anybody like this in your life. I mean, there are only a few people like this on the planet, and also we're talking about at a particular time. I mean, if you meet Brian now, he's still this extraordinary person who I'm sure that is very, very special. But this was a particular moment in his creative life where he was, you know, going through a chrysalis or whatever. I mean, just expanding. He was brilliant, you know, from the first music that he made that we've heard. And there are so many ideas and so much power in all of those early Beach Boys singles. And at the point that, and Pet Sounds was this breakthrough in which he was sort of self-consciously trying to make a whole album of a sound that he heard in his head that was extraordinarily successful. And then he followed that with what he conceived of actually as an R&B track that he'd get some girl singers to sing on and so forth, called Good Vibrations, which eventually ended up being a Beach Boys single. And that, again, was one of the most revolutionary single records that anybody had made up to that time, and is still recognized that way despite the orange juice advertisements. And then the next step was, well, you think that was good, you know, we've got ideas you've never even dreamed of, you know. There's stuff we can do with music that it's like, if this album is, you know, one of the singles expanded to the full length of an album and as rich in ideas as a 2.5-minute Beach Boys single, well, now we're going to take that and multiply it times itself, you know. And there was a feeling in the air. I mean, in England, the Beach Boys, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones would stimulate each other. You know, I mean, certainly the Rolling Stones would not have made as great music as they did if it wasn't that every time the Beatles came out with something new, they were saying, well, you know, we can't let these guys top us. I mean, let's see what we can do. You know, that spirit of kind of friendly competition where you just really put yourself out a lot further than you needed to for, you know, commercial reasons or whatever. And Brian was just full of enthusiasm for what he was doing musically. And in a certain sense felt like, you know, he completely had the world in his hands. I mean, suddenly they were having a kind of success and respectability that had always eluded them.
And then he dropped it.
It's terrifying to have the world in your hands. That's the other side of it. The story that I wrote that David's referring to was actually an interview with a guy named David Anderle, who was at the time the head of Brother Records, the Beach Boys' independent label within Capitol. And he told the story that I was after that is sort of told in the course of this interview is how did this album that was like, for those of us, including myself, who heard pieces of it as it was being done, the most amazing contemporary music that we'd ever heard, why didn't it get completed? You know, how did it get lost? And there's a whole lot of theories and everything else, but basically, very simply, it was too ambitious.
Well, I don't know if it was too ambitious artistically. I think it was a combination of a lot of different elements, from the fact that the Beach Boys were suing Capitol Records at the time that Brian was trying to finish the album, to the fact that Brian and the Beach Boys were at a certain loggerheads over the direction the group should take. Within the Beach Boys themselves, it was, what are you doing, Brian? Mike Love, in particular, has been singled out over the years as the guy who was most vociferous in saying, no, Brian, this isn't the formula that's made us successful. And when you listen to the tapes, of course, he was right. But from an artistic point of view, what Brian was doing was just so far beyond any kind of rock and roll that you could imagine that, I mean, it wasn't rock and roll, it wasn't even pop music. He was doing classical music within a context that somehow he could make popular. I mean, people have compared Brian to someone like Charles Ives. Brian's never sold insurance. I mean, what makes Brian so incredible is that he was avant-garde and commercial at the same time. And that very rarely has happened in our cultural history.
You know, I'm racking my brain for a real obvious example. I'm trying to think who left the group to become something bigger, you know. I'm thinking Kenny Rogers left the first edition, no.
Maybe Peter Gabriel.
You know, just there are a million examples, none of which come to my mind right now.
You're dealing with a unique kind of artistic force, just like if you're dealing with Picasso or something like that, that there aren't any real comparisons.
Well, the simple act of leaving the group to become a bigger, let's say Lionel Richie leaving the Commodores or something,
Right.
that this should have happened.
He never really considered that because it was a family.
But due to what I learned in your book was that you're theorizing that he might indeed have done that and just left and become Brian Wilson, but the forces of the Beach Boy family and the entity that he belonged to kept him in sort of restrained.
He was the eldest son.
Mm-hmm.
He was the benefactor. He made them all rich and famous, and that was his job.
Mm-hmm.
His job, from their point of view, was not to be an artist. And I think that was a force that really was tearing him apart and ultimately led him to say, well, you're not going to have it, and you're not going to have it. And he crossed his arms, and that was the end. Now, a lot of people have talked about drugs being a problem. From what David Anderle says, and David was there from virtually beginning to end, he didn't see drugs as a problem. Later on, it seems that Brian took refuge in drugs to escape the pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But so David says when he was around, that the only kind of drug use was an amphetamine use to keep going, because Brian didn't want to sleep. He wanted to keep working on the music and talking and exploring each other's souls.
Got precedent? That's Elvis in the Army.
Yeah.
That's what happened too. Dominic, I didn't mention that this magazine that Dominic puts out called the Dumb Angel Gazette, Dumb Angel being the original title of...
The book, which is called Look, Listen, Vibrate, Smile, as you can see on that
But
ad there.
Dumb Angel was the original title.
Oh, yeah, Dumb Angel was the original title of Smile.
Of Smile, of that album. Now, you're really fixated on it more than these two guys almost. Now, but they've already got pretty good listens to it. Would you say you've all had equal access to the Missing Smile music?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of the missing tapes, too.
Now, thanks to you, I don't remember where I heard it, but I heard like a long, long version of Good Vibrations that was quite different from the single. I don't remember who had it, but that was odd. That was interesting, and that was a work in progress, I suppose, right? It was the...
One of the things that we're proposing to Capitol, and hopefully it'll come to pass, is this multi-CD set of the Smile material, and one CD alone would be devoted just to the Good Vibration sessions.
I see.
Because there are literally hours of takes and tapes, and you can hear how he put it together. And what we're all trying to say, and what really needs to be heard is the music. Because when you hear the music, you'll go, oh, that's what they're talking about. This is unlike anything I've ever heard before. When Brian Wilson put Good Vibrations together in the studio, he was working on a plane that has nothing to do with rock and roll or popular music. He was creating the synthesizer. He was creating the sampler. He was creating all this studio technique. He really invented the studio as an instrument in rock and roll. The way that earlier Phil had done...
Phil had a little...
Phil,
yeah.
The Wall of Sound was one way to use the studio. Brian came up with another way that was unbelievably influential on the Beatles, who, when they heard what they did of Good Vibrations and Pet Sounds and the Smile in Progress, went back to London and said, hey guys, we got to do something really great. But one thing I have to say, when you asked if Dominic is more fixated on Smile than the rest of us, I think the thing that was great for me recently was hearing Rio Grande from Brian's new album. Because on that 8-minute suite, Brian accomplished in a certain way what he set out to do during the Smile era, which was to, again, bend the form of the popular song. And on Rio Grande, you can hear kind of what he was doing. I mean, it doesn't have Van Dyke Park's lyrics, and Van Dyke Park's lyrics were very important to what Smile was to be, because they were incredibly clever and perceived to be hip and supported the melodies wonderfully. And in and of themselves, you would have to read the lyric 30 or 40 times before you could finally get everything there was. It was kind of like a Firesign Theater album almost.
Or a cinematic thing where it was, as a lot of the Smile music, one of the great things about it was a pictorial piece of music. It's like Rio Grande. When you hear Rio Grande, you can imagine all these things are happening, because Brian used a lot of strange things in the music that he did for Smile. And what he was doing was something that Pink Floyd later on did really effectively, which was use sound effects as music. And not just sound effects, but just a whole pictorial thing. Maybe it was part of hallucination, I don't know, but it was a big, widescreen pictorial music where, for example, most people can relate to Good Vibrations. When you hear the cello, it's sort of like a tension that brings, and he used different instruments in very obscure ways to sort of get things out of you, and Smile was doing that. The music of Smile was an extension of Good Vibrations, where the theremin came in and it was like bending a vibration, sort of like My Favorite Martian, you know? Where it was like levitating everything.
You make references to Brian's sense of humor a lot, and I just realized now while you were talking, I was thinking, Pet Sounds has, what, dog barks?
Dog barking, yes.
So it has the sound of pets in it, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Wait to hear the outtakes from that on the Pet Sound CD if Capitol gets around to releasing that soon. There's
There's
a whole session of him coaxing animal sounds.
What sort of earlier Brian material is available now from Capitol? Not much, I'm led to believe. Right?
Well, they have reissues of most of their LPs, don't they?
Do they pull a song off each
But they
one?
pull like 2 songs off. So here's albums that are under 25 minutes or about 25 minutes when they first came out, and now they're like about 20 minutes. So it's really, but hopefully what Capitol will do, we've been hearing that each LP will have some outtakes on it.
Oh, great.
So.
Ultimately, someone will wake up and realize there's a lot of money to be made, and I mean, that's what Brian's solo album will accomplish, if nothing else, at Capitol. Is say, hey, wait a second, we can cash in on this. And
there's no precedent in American records of outtakes. I mean, I buy the Jerry Lee Lewis box set where it's got 15 takes of High School Confidential, and I love it. I listen to everyone, and I say, oh, that's a little different.
It's new. Clearly, CDs have finally brought this to us, you know.
Have they? I mean,
yes. I mean,
who's
you can buy
it?
John Coltrane CDs now that have 6 outtakes from the Giant Steps sessions as well as Giant Steps itself on it.
Is that right?
And it's terrific. I mean, we've needed this for a long time, but the fact of the CD, the kind of audience that buys it, and the amount of space that they have on it, and certain marketing considerations have finally made, you know, the issuing of unreleased or alternate tracks. Obviously, mentally, they're going to think of alternate tracks first in jazz being what it is. But fortunately, we're starting to make a breakthrough where, I mean, given the amount of interest there is in the Beatles, it's pretty ridiculous that we can't go out and buy...
Beatles sessions.
Not just Beatles sessions, which all the collectors have, but there are like live shows from the BBC, you know, where they'd sing 20 or 30 different songs live. They're wonderful. And you know, with that early voice and energy, and there's a terrific market for that stuff, but it's like people don't even think that way. You know, it's like, oh, well, it's supposed to be the finished record. And I mean, I'm very excited to hear what David's saying, because still in the record business now, you can see where there would be a strong mentality saying, well, let's get a producer in who can take all these tracks and put them together into a record that might make some sense. You know what I mean? Instead of putting out
convert it to Duophonics, too.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, they just totally destroyed the mono basic simplicity, too.
I mean, we're almost out of time, but that's an interesting consideration. At least that the fact that Brian heard in mono, recorded in mono, and any stereo albums, even contemporarily when they came out, were phonies because they were the Duophonics, right?
Well, they don't have to be. I mean, Brian recorded in 4 and 8 track towards the end of his peak years, so someone can come in and mix in that. Brian, of course, is deaf in one ear, which makes his accomplishments even more remarkable. But the fact that he recorded in mono, he once explained, was that he didn't think the listener should have the right to change the way it sounded. I guess if he knew everyone had a graphic equalizer at home.
That's the thing. Brian had said that it's all up to speaker placement and where you put the speakers in your room. In the early 60s, all rock and roll era, 50s also, the compression and everything hit you in a very direct way. And that's what Brian wanted to do, you know, and I'm sure mostly Chuck Berry or anybody else, too. Their records were coming out of a car radio, which was just slamming you away. It wasn't this spread out, luxurious thing. Rock and roll isn't meant to hit you in sort of a flaccid, dreamy way in your house. It's meant to sort of kick you in the butt. And so that's why, you know, mono recordings are so much nicer. We enjoy them more anyway.
Yeah, back to mono. That's what everybody we know says.
Well, Brian, like, you know, a lot of great artists through history, is a real primitive. I mean, he's taking he's just saying, I hear a sound, here's this thing in my head, let's see how I can put it out into music. I mean, he's not coming from like an education of this is this and that is that. It's just whatever you can grab that you can throw into it to kind of get what you're trying to create at that moment.
Yeah, he's totally self-taught. I ran into a guy the other day in a photo lab who we started talking. He says, yeah, I used to work at Wallach's Music City, and Brian would come in all the time and buy nothing but classical records.
Huh.
I mean, that's how Brian learned what instruments did, just by listening.
Right.
And I mean, he just is an instinctive genius. I mean, he just knows how to do it. And what Dominic was saying about the wide screen is Brian. I mean, he has this way of making feelings visual. He would say to an engineer, I want this to sound like what a milkshake tastes like after you've been running. Or I want this to sound like what it feels like to walk in a forest after it's rained. And it sounds off the wall, but he's able to get that sound, and that's what's so fascinating when you listen to the Smile tapes.
Or Rio Grande.
Or Rio Grande. Rio Grande is a trip down a river. It's like a ride at Disneyland.
In addition to the raw genius and musical ability, something that perhaps goes with it, or perhaps it's coincidence, is the personal presence of a creative power like this, who, like, when he says something like that to you, everybody around is just moved, I mean, whether they even know who he is, moved to want to try to cooperate with this person and somehow bring into existence this impossible thing that they're asking for. So there's that charismatic quality when he's doing what he's about.
See, when Paul called it the moment in late '66 when he was there, and it was at that moment where Brian had convinced everyone he could pull it off.
Yeah.
And then it fell apart in '67. But when Paul was there, that's when it was all happening.
But actually...
Good night, but go on.
but actually, he did pull it off, and it's on tape, and we want to see it out.
Yeah, darn right.
Yeah.
Write a letter to Capitol Records.
And it will sell.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, all around the world.
And there'll even be a Good Vibration single with just Brian's voice on it.
Whoa.
What do you mean?
Well, he did guide vocals for the sessions, and with the original lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
So we could release a single from the Smile sessions under the name Brian Wilson, with just his voice on it.
I see.
And then there's a version of Surf's Up where he just sits at the piano by himself, and